you are kneeling on cold stone. Your wrists are bound behind your back with silk cords that cost more than your freedom. The mask on your face itches, but you cannot move to scratch it. It is not meant for anonymity. It is meant for allure. Around you, candles flicker in golden holders shaped like lions, saints, and naked boys. The room smells of rose oil, sweat, and something sweet rotting beneath. You are 13 years old, or maybe 15. The men prefer you not to know. You are property here, not sold outright, but rented by the hour. You are a putano, trained to smile, to serve wine without trembling, and to pretend that the pleasure is yours. You are not alone. There are dozens like you, beautiful, hairless, obedient. This is not a brothel. It is a palazzo. This is not a secret. It is a fashion. The masked man standing above you is an archbishop. He will not remove his cross. He never does. He will say a prayer first. Then he will open your robe, and you will not speak, because the last one who spoke was taken away. This is Venice, and the year is 1520, the most serene republic, the jewel of Europe, a place of art, wealth, and beauty. But beneath the marble facades and moonlit canals lies another Venice, a hidden city of masks and silence, where children were not only bought but sculpted, where sex was not just a commodity but a currency of power, and where boyhood ended not with age but with purchase. This is the story they do not tell in guidebooks. This is the history painted over by Titian and veiled in incense smoke. It is the story of the secret world of male prostitution in Renaissance Venice, and it begins here, in this room, with a prayer whispered over your bare skin. Before we continue, if you enjoy learning about the dark and forgotten chapters of history, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us create more content like this. Now, let's begin with the world that made this possible, because what happened in Venice was no accident. It was designed, sanctioned, and desired by the highest in society and the holiest in church, by doges and dukes, by cardinals and commoners alike. The boys were not stolen from the shadows. They were taken from poor homes with promises, from orphanages with no doors, from theatres, where a feminine voice could mean a job or a death. They were not all unwilling. Some were taught to believe it was love. Some were taught to believe it was God's will. Most were taught to never speak of it again. Venice, after all, had laws against sodomy, but those laws were for the poor, not for the masked, not for the ones who hosted parties on gondolas while boys in silk tunics served wine laced with laudanum. This was not debauchery in back alleys. This was ritual, celebration, display, and profit. Pain became pageant, abuse became aesthetic, and silence above all became survival. But no silence lasts forever. In hidden court records, we find names, in letters burned at the edges, we find confessions, and in the paintings hung high in the basilicas, we find symbols hidden in plain sight, a boy with a bare shoulder, a ribbon around the throat, a glance too tender to be holy. They told us this was art, but art, in Venice, was always a mask. The truth was never meant to be spoken, but it was lived, night after night, by children whose names were never recorded, only their beauty. This is their story, not despite religion, but because of it. Venice in the 16th century was a city unlike any other, a republic ruled not by kings, but by councils, a place suspended between east and west, where silks from Constantinople mingled with incense from the cathedrals, where the clang of merchants' bells echoed beneath the toll of church bells. It was a city that prided itself on order, an illusion delicately maintained by masks. But beneath the surface, Venice was also a city of contradictions, a devoutly Catholic state that tolerated and in many ways enabled systems of vice so intricate they bordered on statecraft. Male prostitution was not merely a hidden shame of the Venetian underworld, it was a phenomenon woven into the very social and legal fabric of the Republic. To understand how this could be, we must first understand the world in which these boys existed, a world where beauty was currency, where hierarchy was sacred, and where silence was law. The Renaissance brought with it a revival of classical ideals, not just in art and architecture, but in the erotic imagination. The Greco-Roman admiration for youthful male beauty returned with fervor. Statues of Ganymede and Antinous graced gardens and villas. Plato's Symposium was read not as philosophy, but as instruction. This classical lens provided the elite with a convenient justification. To love a boy was to participate in something ancient, something cultured, something divine. But the church at least officially condemned sodomy with fire and ash. The penalty for a male caught in homosexual activity could be as severe as burning alive. But in practice, these punishments were rarely applied to the powerful. The inquisitors focused their wrath on the poor, the foreign, and the disposable. In 1532, Venice established the Ufficiali del Notte, the officers of the night. Their job was to police sexual crimes, particularly sodomy, but as the archives reveal, their efforts were inconsistent at best and often tragically selective. The Ufficiali recorded hundreds of cases, many involving boys under the age of 16. The perpetrators, not always anonymous. Some were nobles. Some were priests. Some were even judges, but the majority were never punished. Instead, they paid fines, or, in some cases, offered their victims as new informants to help identify other targets, usually rivals or political enemies. Venetian law operated on a sliding scale of morality. It was not what you did, but who you were when you did it. This created a market not just for flesh, but for protection. Boys who entered the system could be kept by patrons, wealthy men who offered housing, food, and clothing in exchange for absolute obedience. These relationships were sometimes recorded as guardianship or apprenticeship in official documents. But behind the closed doors of the palazzi, their purpose was unspoken and unmistakable. Venice was also a city of spectacle. Masquerades and carnivals offered the perfect alibi. During Carnivali, gender became fluid, identity became play, and masks allowed men to engage in forbidden desires without consequence. In these spaces, the lines between theatre and transaction blurred. Boys were dressed as girls not simply to deceive, but to titillate. This was not hidden, it was performed, and the audiences included clergy. The role of the church in this system is perhaps the most jarring. Though sodomy was a mortal sin, the confessional became a revolving door for absolution. Priests who preyed upon altar boys simply repented only to return again. Monasteries were not immune. In fact, some of the puttani originated within ecclesiastical institutions, trained first as choir boys, then as favorites of abbots and bishops. The culture of secrecy was absolute, and in Venice, secrecy was a form of governance. The Council of Ten, Venice's feared internal security force, maintained strict control over public morality, while allowing private vice to flourish, so long as it did not disrupt order. It is in this contradiction that the secret world of male prostitution thrived, not in opposition to power but as an extension of it. We must also consider the economic forces. Venice was a mercantile empire. Everything was for sale. Spice, silk, glass and flesh. The puttani were not only local boys. Some were imported from Dalmatia, Albania, and Greece. Others were orphans, or sons sold by desperate families. In a republic without kings, the doge was merely a symbol, but wealth was real, and pleasure, like politics, was carefully choreographed. To be invited to certain salons or private performances meant access to power, and in many cases, a boy was part of the invitation. But the boys themselves, they had no invitation, no voice. They were property in all but name, silken puppets in the hands of masked men. And when they aged out, when their voices deepened, their bodies matured, they were discarded, often sent to sea, sometimes jailed. More often, they simply disappeared. Their names are found only in court records, their voices never. You wake before dawn. The room is silent except for shallow breaths and the occasional rustle of linen around you. Boys lie in narrow beds, each one identical, no names, only numbers, stitched into their nightshirts with golden thread. A bell rings once, no words are spoken. You rise, wash your face in cold water, and kneel, not to pray, to be inspected. A tall man with a ledger enters the dormitory. He walks the line with deliberate slowness, studying each boy in turn. Eyes, teeth, skin, posture. Bruises are noted, so are erections. A servant trails behind him with a box of oils and salves. You are taught to say nothing, even when touched. Especially then, this is not a prison. Not officially. It is a casa di preparazione, a house of refinement. There are several in Venice, some run by older men with connections to the courts, some by widows with no sons. A few are tied to guilds, disguised as theatre troupes or music schools. All serve the same purpose, to transform boys into commodities of pleasure. Training begins with silence, then movement. You learn to walk in slippers on marble without sound. You learn to serve wine without spilling, to bow without showing fear, to smile without joy. A misstep means the switch. A refusal means isolation. Next comes the voice. You are coached to speak softly, almost lyrically. Some boys are castrated early, to preserve the high timbre. The ones who survive the operation become prized. The ones who do not are buried in unmarked graves behind the chapels. Then comes the touch. Older boys already broken in demonstrate positions, gestures, techniques. These sessions are clinical, methodical. You are told this is for art, for duty, that the patrons are great men, that if you perform well, you may one day live in a palace, wear velvet, and eat figs from golden plates. They do not tell you what happens when you fail, because you have seen it. The boy who screamed too loudly was gone the next day. The boy who bled too much was never named again. In the evenings, visitors arrive, nobles, ambassadors, cardinals. They come under the guise of charity or education. They bring books, gifts, coins. They watch the boys dance in pairs, sometimes in dresses, sometimes nude. They select favorites with a nod. The chosen boy is bathed, perfumed, and masked, then led to the back room. The rest are sent to their cots. The next morning, nothing is said, but everyone knows. This is the rhythm of the house. Obedience, performance, reward, silence. The boys who rise through the ranks are assigned to Salotti exclusive salons hosted by powerful patrons. These gatherings are not orgies, not in the way you might imagine. They are orchestrated displays of beauty and influence. A masked boy playing the lute, another reading Petrarch by candlelight, a third pouring wine with trembling hands, his robe slipping just enough to reveal a shoulder. The guests observe, laugh, comment, then retire in pairs or groups, each with a boy in tow. There are rules. Some patrons are gentle, most are not. Drugs are common. Laudanum in wine, opium in honey. Some boys learn to disassociate. Others go blank. A few, just a few, come to believe it is love. The ones who do are the easiest to keep. They write poetry, sing for their patrons, defend them. Some even become spies. Because in Venice, information is power, and no one hears more than the putano in the bedchamber of a senator. These boys are not slaves in the legal sense, but they have no freedom. They are not prostitutes by choice, but they are trained to smile as if they are. Most are illiterate, but a few are taught to read, to serve higher-ranking clients. The ones who speak Greek or Latin can fetch higher prices. Those who can sing or dance are paraded at court festivals. There are even contests. Unofficial, quiet, but real. For the most beautiful boy, the most obedient, the most skilled, prizes are whispered, a silver necklace, a chamber of his own, a trip to Padua. But the true reward is protection. A patron who values you may shield you from the worst, until he grows bored. Then, you are returned to the house, and the cycle begins again. The average boy lasts 5 years in the system, some less, a few longer. When they grow too old, usually by 17, they are deemed consunti, consumed. They may be cast out. Some try to join the navy. Others vanish into the alleys. A few are found floating in the lagoon, hands bound, stones in their bellies. The system ensures they are forgotten, but their footprints remain, in the floor plans of the palazzi, in the records of the Ufficiali del Notte, in the margins of poems by poets too ashamed to sign their names, and in the paintings of masked boys holding lilies, their eyes too old for their faces. There was no scandal, no great public reckoning, because the system was never meant to be seen. Venice, unlike the kingdoms of France or Spain, governed itself through layers of bureaucracy by committees, councils, magistrates, and masks, and in that complexity, secrets could thrive. Male prostitution in Renaissance. Venice was not the result of a failure of morality, it was the consequence of policy. Managed vice, controlled pleasure, and silent consent were tools of governance. And boys beautiful, obedient, disposable were instruments in that system. The city's obsession with order began with the Serenissima herself. Venice prided itself on being a republic of laws. But law, in Venice, did not mean justice. It meant balance, stability, reputation. The Ufficiali del Notte, or officers of the night, were created in the early 16th century as a moral police force. They're charged to root out sodomy, sexual deviance, and public disorder, but in practice, their work functioned less like enforcement and more like calibration. Their records were meticulous, but not neutral. The majority of arrests were of foreigners, lower-class men, or those without political connections, most of the elite. However, those who hosted salons, who kept boys, who arranged masked assignations were simply not touched, or, if accused, quietly fined. Sometimes they paid in coin, sometimes in favors. The city's ruling council of 10 oversaw internal security, but their gaze was trained outward on plots, spies, political dissent, a scandal involving a bishop and a choir boy. Not a threat to the Republic unless it threatened Venice's reputation abroad. In this way, the practice of using boys for sexual pleasure became invisible, not by hiding it, but by codifying it in euphemism. Legal documents referred to domestic apprentices. Theatre contracts hid payments for boys under performance stipends. Guilds allowed boys under 16 to live with masters, with no oversight, and the church, the great moral authority, washed its hands with rituals of forgiveness. Confession was a shield. Repentance, A revolving door. Priests and monks who violated boys were often simply transferred to another parish. Occasionally, they would be sent abroad to the Dalmatian coast, or to Rome. But never to prison, never to shame. Even the Inquisition, which did prosecute sodomy, rarely interfered in Venice unless invited. Venice guarded its autonomy with ferocity. Not even the Pope could dictate her laws. This autonomy created a vacuum of accountability. And into that vacuum, the system of puttane, male courtesans and child prostitutes flourished. But there was another force that sustained the trade: commerce. Venice was a city of merchants. Ships arrived daily from the Levant, from Egypt, from Crete. Everything had a price: silk, sugar, salt, and boys. The same networks that trafficked spices trafficked flesh. Boys from the Balkans, captured in raids, or sold by families, were brought into Venice under the guise of servitude. Once inside the city, their fates were sealed. Venice did not recognize slavery in name, but it allowed lifelong contracts of service. And these contracts, once signed, often with a child's thumbprint, were rarely broken. Some boys were kept in noble houses, others were rotated among salons, performances, and private gatherings, but all were bound by the same rule: silence. And should that silence break, punishment was swift, not always from the state, often from the patrons themselves. A boy who accused a powerful man could vanish within days. A whisper of madness, a note in the asylum records, a body in the canal. This was not paranoia, it was administration. Venice managed vice the way it managed trade. It allowed just enough to sustain desire but not enough to cause collapse. This balance extended to the visual arts. Painters like Titian and Giorgione portrayed boys with languid eyes and sensual curves, cloaked in the language of myth. Ganymede ascending, Narcissus gazing, Saint Sebastian pierced, not only by arrows, but by glances. These images were not warnings, they were invitations. The church hung them in chapels, the nobles commissioned them for private devotion, and all the while, the boys were watching themselves be painted, idealized, and erased in the same stroke. One might ask, how did no one object? The truth is, many did. There were friars who condemned the practice from the pulpit. There were citizens who petitioned the Council of Ten. There were even riots, occasionally when rumors of child deaths stirred the lower classes. But the system responded with precision. A few arrests, a scapegoat, a quiet trial, and then silence again. Because in Venice, scandal was not a crisis, it was a threat to trade, and trade was sacred. What kept the system alive was not the wickedness of a few, it was the indifference of many. The bureaucrat who ignored the signs, the priest who forgave too easily, the artist who beautified pain, and the parent who believed the lie that a son in velvet was better than a son in hunger. This was how the world worked. And the boys, they learned quickly: to survive, you must never say no. To be safe, you must be pleasing. To have worth, you must be wanted. Even if only for a season. By the late 17th century, the Venetian Republic began to decline. Trade routes shifted. The Ottoman Wars drained coffers. The old salons grew quieter. The masquerades thinner. The pleasure palaces crumbled slowly beneath the weight of time. And with them, the carefully maintained system of performance and abuse began to erode. But systems like this do not simply vanish. They linger in memory, in behavior, in law, in the minds of those who lived through them. The boys who aged out of the Putano system were rarely given new roles in society. They had no trades, no family names of value, no property to their name. Most had never learned to read. Some turned to begging. Others joined the merchant fleets, sailing to Alexandria or Cyprus, where silence remained a virtue. Some never made it out. Those who had been kept in palazzi by noble patrons often found themselves discarded with a final gift: a small sum of money, a servant's tunic, and a warning not to speak. A few tried. In 1709, a boy named Girolamo, once employed in the home of a retired magistrate, attempted to bring charges of depravazione against his former patron. The trial never concluded. Girolamo vanished during recess. The records show a simple notation: assente, motivi ignoti, absent, reason unknown. He was 16. The psychological toll left no physical records, but it existed in trembling hands, in broken relationships, in the inability to trust, to speak, to sleep. Many former putani were known to frequent the ospedali dei pazzi, the madhouses. Their conditions were labelled with vague terms: melancholia, delusions, hysteria. None were treated. Most were sedated. One priest, writing anonymously in 1734, confessed to hearing the cries of boys long discarded by their masters in his dreams. He called them ghosts without tongues. But ghosts leave traces. The rituals of grooming, the aesthetics of youth, The dynamics of dominance and submission continued. Even when the formal salons faded, the expectations remained. In certain aristocratic circles, it was still common well into the 18th century for noblemen to take on companions as part of their household staff. The language changed, the practice did not. In the artistic realm, the idealization of youthful male beauty persisted. Painters in the Baroque era continued to depict smooth-skinned boys in sensual poses, often under the guise of mythological themes. Collectors prized such works. The church did not interfere. The damage went deeper still. Venetian society, having normalized the commodification of young boys for centuries, left a legacy of silence and confusion around consent, desire, and power. Boys were taught their value was tied to their appeal, that obedience could buy protection, that beauty could be a weapon but also a curse. This confusion bled into broader social structures, into how teachers treated students, how masters treated apprentices, how priests treated altar boys. The echoes reached well beyond the canals of Venice. Throughout southern Europe, especially in port cities, similar systems developed, smaller, less organized, but clearly inspired. Marseille, Naples, Dubrovnik, places where commerce thrived and where silence could be bought cheaply. Meanwhile, in Venice, a strange phenomenon began to take shape by the mid-18th century. A growing nostalgia. Writers romanticized the salons. Painters recreated scenes of masked boys and candlelit courtyards. Historians spoke of a lost elegance, but they did not speak of the bruises. They did not speak of the children. They spoke of the art of youth. They called it culture. Venice leaned into the myth. Tourists arrived, seeking romance, decadence, mystery. The city offered gondola rides and glass trinkets, and behind it all, the old palazzi still stood. Some had been converted into hotels, others into museums. The rooms were dusted, the mirrors cleaned, but the walls remembered. In one such building, a small plaque near a former music conservatory notes that young performers once trained here under noble patronage. It does not say what kind of performance. The long-term consequence of this system was not merely the trauma of its victims, it was the cultural erasure of their suffering. A historical sleight of hand. Turn the boy into a painting, frame the painting in gold, hang it in a cathedral, and forget the name of the boy. In recent decades, scholars have begun to uncover fragments, court documents, private letters, confessions written in code, each one a thread in a tapestry too long hidden. The evidence is not complete, but the pattern is clear. Venice, in its golden age, did not merely tolerate the sexual exploitation of boys, it institutionalized it, masked it in ritual, wrapped it in art, and buried it beneath centuries of silence. You are standing in a room that no longer exists. The walls have been repainted, the floor scrubbed, the altar removed. A velvet rope now blocks the doorway. Tourists pass through it every day, guided by the promise of Renaissance splendor. They admire the chandeliers, the frescoed ceiling, the wide arched windows that open toward the Grand Canal. They do not ask who once knelt here. They do not ask what happened behind the curtain. History, after all, has done its job. It has erased the boy, not with malice, with silence. Venice sells silence now. It packages it in postcards and oil paintings, in gondola songs and carnival masks. It turns its past into performance. But not all performances are equal, and not all stories survive. The boys of the Patano system left no memoirs. They were taught not to write, not to speak, not to remember, but they existed. Their bodies bore the weight of an empire's desire, their minds, the confusion of love mistaken for power. They were not victims in the eyes of the law, nor were they criminals. They were ornaments, flesh woven into the political tapestry of a republic that measured its greatness, not only in trade and territory, but in the discipline of silence. The long echoes of that silence reach further than we admit, because Venice was not alone. Across history, across continents, systems rise that exploit the young under the guise of beauty, obedience, and art. From the Ottoman harems to the castrati choirs of Italy, from the theatre boys of Elizabethan London to the child dancers of Mughal courts, the names change, but the silence is the same. It tells us this is tradition, this is refinement, this is normal. And so it continues. What does it mean to inherit a silence? To walk the corridors of a palazzo built on suffering and hear nothing? To admire the paintings and never ask who the model was? What does it mean to love a city that once trained children to please men and called it culture? It means we must look harder. It means we must learn to read what was never written, to hear the voices that were never allowed to speak, to ask why beauty so often requires a body, and why history so often forgets whose body it was. There are names, still, scattered through forgotten court ledgers and crumbling personal letters. Angelo, Marco, Peter, Luca, some listed only by first name, some simply as the boy. Their stories do not have endings. only erasure, but endings are not the same as conclusions. Somewhere in the archives of Venice, a trembling signature still exists at the bottom of a forced confession, a lock of hair in an old reliquary, a blood stain beneath a layer of paint. Proof, if we are willing to see it, not of guilt, of existence. They were here. They were not myths. They were not symbols. They were not aesthetic. They were boys. And they were human. When we forget that, we do not just lose the past, we make space for the future to repeat it. Because systems of power never disappear. They adapt. Today, exploitation wears a different mask. It lives in supply chains and fashion runways, in sweatshops and screen contracts, in the blurred lines of influence and consent, but it speaks the same language. Obedience, beauty, silence, and we are still fluent in it. So what can be done? We remember, not in vague terms, not in apologies etched in plaques, but in voices. We tell the story as it was. We speak the names we can. We ask questions where others are quiet. We look beyond the paint, beyond the mask, beyond the candlelight. We see the boy, still kneeling, still waiting, not for rescue, not for pity, for acknowledgement. A history cannot be undone, but it can be unforgotten, and sometimes that is the only justice left. You are standing in a room that no longer exists, but he is still there, and now you see him.